My son's wife sent me an email about the Christmas plans. This Christmas, Mom, please don't come. It's only for immediate family. I was deeply shocked when I saw those words. I realized this wasn't an invitation, it was a way of excluding me from my own family. But what they didn't know was that I had discovered a secret that would make them all regret it. I'm truly grateful that you're here. Before the story continues, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Also, please note parts of this story include fictional elements added for storytelling and learning purposes. Any similarity to real names or places is purely coincidental. The rhythmic circular motion of the polishing cloth against Richard's heavy silver teapot usually acted as my anchor, but today the silence of the house felt like a physical weight against my chest. Catherine Vance, a 66-year-old retired pediatric cardiologist, was meticulously polishing my late husband Richard's silver tea set when the chime of my phone shattered the quiet of my Seattle home. "Just a bit more shine, Richard," I whispered to the empty air of the kitchen. "You always hated a dull table." There was a clinical comfort in the acrid metallic scent of the silver polish and the cold, smooth texture of the teapot. For 40 years, my hands had performed surgery on the smallest hearts imaginable, requiring a precision that didn't allow for tremors or doubt. Now those same hands were relegated to maintaining the luster of a life that had largely moved on without me. I took a deep breath, trying to dispel the melancholy that had become my frequent companion since Richard passed 4 years ago. I set the cloth aside, admiring the way the light from the gray Seattle afternoon caught the curves of the silver, reflecting a distorted version of my own tired face. Then the chime. A sharp digital intrusion that cut through 4 years of widowhood. I wiped my hands and picked up the device, the blue glare of the smartphone screen stinging against the dim kitchen light as I saw an email notification from my daughter-in-law, Briar. My heart gave a small, hopeful flutter, expecting perhaps a video of the twins Pearl and Faye, practicing their violins for the holiday recital, or a simple query about what I should bring for Christmas dinner. Instead, the subject line read, "About Christmas plans." My stomach did a slow, sickening roll before I even tapped the screen. Nobody sends a formal email about Christmas plans unless the news is meant to be a barrier. I read the words once, then again, the air in the kitchen suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. Briar wrote that she and Julian had been talking with her mother, Leona, and they had decided to keep Christmas Day just for immediate family. Immediate family. Was 40 years of being a Vance not enough to qualify for the inner circle? The email continued with a practiced sugary venom, thanking me for my continued tuition support for the girls, but stating that their new therapist, a Dr. Miranda Kaplan, had advised limiting overstimulation during the holidays. The implication was as sharp as a scalpel. My presence was now a medical liability. I sat frozen, the phone vibrating in my hand, as a third reading confirmed the eviction. I had spent the last 5 years funding every luxury in that household, from the private academy fees to the artisanal summer camps, yet when the holiday table was set, I was being diagnosed right out of my own family. My clinical brain, usually so adept at diagnosing anomalies, began to whir with a different kind of data. Dr. Miranda Kaplan. In 40 years of practicing medicine in this city, I had never heard of her, and my clinical instinct told me this wasn't just a schedule conflict, it was a diagnosis of my own obsolescence. The doctor's name felt like a placeholder in a poorly constructed lie, a medical fiction designed to keep the ATM machine outside, while the family enjoyed the withdrawal. I set the polishing cloth down, the oily residue of the silver cream staining my fingertips like a confession, and reached for my laptop with a hand that had suddenly begun to tremble. My clinical instinct regarding Dr. Kaplan was screaming a high-pitched frequency that demanded data to quiet it. I needed to see the numbers, the cold, hard receipts of a devotion that had apparently reached its expiration date in the eyes of my children. Opening the lid, the blue, sterile light of the laptop screen washed over me, highlighting the grime on my skin as I logged into my private investment accounts. I navigated through the menus with practiced speed, my eyes scanning the dwindling balances that Richard and I had built over 40 years. We had planned for quiet cruises, a cabin on Orcas Island, and the security of a top-tier medical plan. Instead, I saw a history of massive outflows, a digital hemorrhage that was making my retirement look like a charity case. Where did it all go, Richard? I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking in the silence of the kitchen. I thought I was building their future, but I was just fueling a fire that was eventually meant to consume me. My cursor hovered over the most recent transfers. Each one was labeled Lakeside Prep, but the destination account wasn't the Academy. It was JW Consulting, LLC. I felt a sudden sharp chill. Julian Vance, my 41-year-old son, who ran a boutique marketing consultancy, always had a way of looking everywhere, but at my eyes, when he was hiding something. And I realize now that he had been hiding the very destination of my life's work. Grief is a master thief, but I was beginning to realize that my son had been the one holding the bag while I looked the other way. My mind drifted back to late 2019, just weeks after Richard's funeral. The scent of cedar in the Vance estate garden had been thick that afternoon. Julian had approached me, his eyes red-rimmed and his voice thick with a calculated vulnerability. He told me his firm was facing a slow start and he couldn't swing the girls' tuition. Mom-Dad always wanted the girls at Lakeside, he'd said, leaning into my grief. I just need a bridge until the Q4 contracts close. Of course, Julian, I had replied, my heart breaking for him. Don't worry about the money. We take care of family. Your father would have wanted this. I agreed, instantly blinded by the shared loss and the desperate desire to hold the remnants of my family together. Have you ever looked at someone you raised and realized you were looking at a stranger wearing your own son's face? He had even asked me to sign a specific power of attorney for an education fund. Back then, a document I now realized gave him much broader access to my liquidity than I ever intended to grant. As the cursor blinked on that very first 2019 transfer, I noticed a second withdrawal authorized on the same day, a consulting fee for $15,000 I didn't remember ever seeing or signing off on. My heart turned to ice as the mathematical reality began to settle in. This wasn't just a temporary bridge. It was a permanent redirection of my life's blood into a consultancy that seemed to produce nothing but debt and deception. Numbers don't lie, but people do, and as I stared at the cumulative total on my calculator, the digits felt like ice water in my veins. The ice had already begun to form when I spotted that $15,000 consulting fee from 2019. I remember that year vividly. Julian had shown up at the house in a sleek midnight blue sedan, beaming about a performance bonus from a new client. I had toasted his success with a glass of lemonade, never dreaming I had actually paid for the leather seats and the European engineering myself. That $15,000 was the entry point to a much deeper cavern of deceit. I pulled the physical files from my desk, the dry, papery smell of old bank statements filling the kitchen. My fingers moved with surgical precision, a sharp, rhythmic tapping of the calculator keys, echoing against the backsplash. I started with the big numbers, the tuition for Lakeside Prep that I thought was going directly to the bursar, $350,000 over 5 years. But as I cross-referenced the JW Consulting transfers with Julian's occasional frantic texts about school supplies and summer programs, a secondary layer of theft emerged. Another $80,000 had vanished into a black hole of miscellaneous expenses, summer camps in the Berkshires, and extracurriculars for which I had never seen a single receipt. The total on the small digital screen glared back at me, $430,000. That was our retirement, Richard, I whispered. That was the cabin in Orcas Island we never bought because we wanted to ensure the girls had the best start. 6 figures. That's the price they put on my love. The realization was a physical weight, heavier than the silver I had been polishing earlier. I leaned back, the bitter taste of cold coffee lingering on my tongue as I looked at my reflection in the darkened kitchen window. I saw a tired, aging face, but more than that, I saw a person I didn't recognize. I thought I was the matriarch, the steady hand guiding the next generation through the storm of Richard's passing. Instead, I had been relegated to a utility. I thought of the phone calls from Julian and Briar over the last 12 months. They never called just to talk. The conversations always followed a scripted path, a brief update on the girls' grades, a mention of how much they missed me, and then the pivot. "We're so lucky to have you," Mom Julian would say, his voice smooth as silk. By the way, the girls need new violins and the insurance for the school trip is due Friday. I wasn't their mother anymore. I was a transaction. I had become an ATM machine with a grandmother's face dispensing affection in the form of direct deposits. Even more galling was the realization that Julian had been auto-drafting a management fee from my secondary savings account for the last 6 months, without so much as a verbal mention. I had trusted him with the passwords during my bout with the flu last spring, and he had used that window to install a permanent siphon. I wasn't just being excluded from Christmas, I was being liquidated. My own family was strip mining my life while I was still living it. And if I was just a machine to them, then it was time to see how they'd survive once the power was cut. I closed the laptop, the silence of the kitchen now feeling less like a burden and more like a tactical advantage. The valet at Canlis recognized my Lexus, a small courtesy that usually felt like home. But that evening, the midsummer heat of Seattle felt thick with a warning I chose to ignore. As I handed over the keys, my mind was still reeling from the cold calculations I had performed in my kitchen. The resolution to cut off the financial support burned in my chest like a slow-release tablet, bitter and necessary. I was a machine to them, I had realized, but as I smoothed my skirt and prepared to enter the restaurant, I knew the power hadn't been cut just yet. I had one more performance to give. The interior of Canlis was an architectural embrace of cedar and glass overlooking the dusk-stained waters of Lake Union. Julian was already there, standing near our booth. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, stepping forward to press a dry kiss to my cheek. "You look expensive." I offered a thin, practiced smile. "It is just the pearls, Julian. A gift to myself for surviving another year." My career as a pediatric cardiologist had once made these luxuries feel like the natural rewards of a life spent in high-stakes precision, but today the opulence felt like a stage set. I watched my son closely as we sat. He was unusually jittery, his fingers tapping a rhythmic nervous code against the crisp white linen of the tablecloth. His eyes kept darting toward the entrance, searching for something or someone, and I felt the first prickle of apprehension. I realized then that the table had been set for 3. Julian hadn't just forgotten to mention a guest. He had actively coordinated an ambush. I sipped my water, the condensation on the chilled glass dampening my palm. Then the scent hit me, heavy jasmine and desperation. Leona had arrived. Leona Mercer Breyer's 64-year-old mother and a former luxury boutique owner adjusted her pearls as if they were a weapon of war before sliding into our booth without a moment's hesitation. "Catherine, darling," she trilled, her voice cutting through the quiet elegance of the room like a jagged blade. I told Julian it would be a crime if I didn't celebrate the woman who makes everything possible. I felt the intrusive shock of her presence vibrate through my chair. "Leona," I said, my voice maintaining its clinical flatline. I wasn't aware Julian had extended the guest list. Julian laughed, a hollow, forced sound that didn't reach his eyes. "I thought it would be a nice surprise, Mom. The more the merrier, right?" He signaled for a waiter, immediately avoiding my gaze. I watched Leona as she draped her flamboyant silk wrap over the back of the seat, her presence already expanding to fill the vacuum of the conversation. How many times had I allowed this woman to occupy space I paid for both in my life and at my table? The clinking of silver against fine china around us felt louder now, an aggressive rhythm to my mounting suspicion. Leona leaned in her smile, not quite reaching the skin around her eyes, and dropped a comment about her wonderful suite at the Fairmont. She hinted quite clearly that she was staying there on Julian's company account, the very same JW Consulting account I had been funding with my retirement. Leona didn't just slide into the seat. She signaled the sommelier for a bottle of vintage Krug that cost more than my first car, and Julian didn't even blink. I watched the golden bubbles rise in Leona's glass, each one representing another $20 of my retirement fund, evaporating into the refined air of the restaurant. The vintage Krug arrived with a flourish, the sommelier performing the ritual of the cork with a gravity that usually commanded respect, but today it felt like a funeral toll for my bank balance. Leona didn't even wait for the first pour to settle before she was dominating the table. "Oh, Julian, darling, don't be a bore," she said, her condescending tone masked by a practiced socialite trill. "It's a celebration order, the lobster, for us all." She didn't look at me for approval, and Julian, to my growing fury, remained silent, playing the part of the successful provider. I felt the tension in my jaw tighten as she continued to order with reckless abandon, adding appetizers and sides that could have fed a small ward. "You've always been so frugal, Catherine," she added with a laugh that felt like a needle prick. "I suppose it's how you managed to save enough for the girls' school." I watched Julian's foot tapping a sharp rhythmic code under the table, his eyes fixed on the condensation of his glass. The smell of expensive lobster thermidor soon filled our booth, but the decadence was lost on me. I was mentally tallying the damage, watching the evening's cost spiral towards several $1,000s, while Julian performed the role of the high-earning consultant. Declined. The word hung in the air like a death sentence for the evening's facade. When the check finally arrived, a cold weight inside a leather bill folder totaling $2,400, Julian had handed over his business credit card with a confident flourish. But the waiter had returned moments later, leaning in with that discreet, apologetic tilt of the head that every person in a place like Canlis fears. Julian's face went from practiced confidence to a pale, blotchy red. I watched him pull out his phone, his thumb swiping frantically. "This is ridiculous," he stammered, his voice rising just enough to draw eyes from the neighboring table. "I just cleared a $50,000 contract this morning. The bank must have flagged the Cabo bookings as fraud." He held the phone to his ear, but as I adjusted my position, I saw his reflection in the dark window glass. He wasn't on a call. He was staring at his home screen, pretending to be on hold while he waited for me to break. "Julian, honey, it's so embarrassing to keep the waiter waiting," Leona sighed dramatically, touching her pearls. Did he really think I was still the same woman who fell for his scraped knee excuses 30 years ago? I knew the theater for what it was, a coordinated pressure tactic. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own card, sliding it into the folder to save the family from public embarrassment. As the waiter walked away, I caught a brief, triumphant smirk shared between Julian and Leona reflected in the glass. It was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by Julian's mask of sheepish gratitude. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand as the waiter returned with my receipt. "I'll Venmo you tomorrow, Mom," he whispered, but his eyes were already drifting back to the champagne bottle, his hunger for the lifestyle far outweighing his shame for the theft. I didn't say a word, but the calculations in my head were no longer just about money. They were about the cost of a final severance. I woke up to the soft Seattle rain tapping against my window, but the real storm was waiting for me inside the glowing rectangle of my smartphone. The previous night's dinner at Canlis remained a bitter weight in my stomach, the memory of Julian's hollow promise to repay the $2,400 hanging over me like a fog. I reached for the phone expecting a Venmo notification or perhaps a contrite text from my son. Instead, I saw a message from a former colleague asking why I looked so small in the family photos she'd seen. I navigated to the online album Breyer had been sharing with relatives and close friends. My thumb hesitated over her profile page. I quickly realized she had restricted my access to certain private galleries from the night before, a deliberate digital curtain pulled across the evening's festivities. But there, in the main public collection, was a new series of photos. The caption gushed with a performative warmth that made the metallic taste of bile rise in my throat. So blessed to celebrate family milestones with the Queen herself, Leona family first. Forever grateful. I scrolled through the image carousel, my heart sinking with every swipe. The lead photo was a glowing portrait of Leona Mercer, laughing with a glass of that vintage Krug I had paid for. I looked for a trace of my own presence at the table I funded, but the images were a curated testament to my invisibility. Does a heart still beat if the people who owe you everything pretend it doesn't exist? I found the group shot the one the waiter had taken while I forced a smile despite the mounting dread. I leaned in, staring at the blue light of the screen in my darkened bedroom. Upon closer inspection, the truth was even more clinical and cruel than mere omission. I hadn't just been ignored, I had been meticulously cropped out. There, at the very margin of the frame, was the edge of my own cream-colored silk sleeve, a pixelated blur of lace and fabric severed by a digital blade. I was a ghost. That's what I was. A ghost with a platinum credit card. I scrolled down to the viewer reactions, finding Julian's name at the very top. "Best night ever," he had written, followed by a heart symbol. He had publicly endorsed the narrative, validating the social story that Leona was the guest of honor at my own birthday dinner. I scrolled through the other photos, my analytical mind searching for patterns. In one candid shot of Julian and Leona clinking glasses, Julian's phone was lying face up on the tablecloth. I zoomed in until the pixels screamed. The screen was lit up with a notification for a high-end luxury watch purchase, a transaction time-stamped just seconds after my own card had been swiped to cover the bill. He hadn't been on the phone with the bank. He had been shopping while I was bailing him out of his performative poverty. "They didn't just forget me," I whispered to the empty room. "They deleted me." I sat there as the rhythmic sound of the rain intensified the cold clarity of the situation settling into my bones. The immediate family email from weeks prior wasn't a sudden change of heart or a medical necessity involving a phantom doctor. It was the final stage of a long-planned vanishing act. I was being liquidated, stripped of my status and my presence, while my resources continued to fuel their illusions. Staring at the blurred edge of my own shoulder in Breyer's photo, I realized that for my son and his wife, I was no longer a person. I was an estate to be settled while I was still breathing. The digital shriek of my phone on the nightstand didn't just wake me. It felt like a defibrillator jolt to a heart that was already weary of the Vance name. I fumbled in the dark, my fingers grazing the cold wood before finding the source of the noise. It was 12:14 a.m. The caller ID flashed Julian's name and my breath hitched. In the months since that birthday dinner at Canlis, the digital silence between us had been a wound I'd carefully tended. Yet here he was, tearing it open in the dead of night. I swiped to answer, pressing the phone to my ear as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to amplify. "Julian?" I whispered, my voice thick with sleep. "What happened, Mom, please?" He stammered, his voice thick with panic and the unmistakable ghost of a sob. "They're going to humiliate them. I missed a notice." A server error at the office. He went on to claim that Lakeside Prep had sent a final notice for $18,000. And if the funds weren't in the account by 8 a.m., Pearl and Faye would be escorted out of their classes in front of everyone. "Julian, slow down," I said, sitting up as my dry sandpaper eyes tried to focus on the shadows of my bedroom. 18,000. On top of the 70 I already sent this fall. He was intentionally calling now, I realized, knowing my cognitive defenses were at their lowest. Expulsion. The word was a scalpel, and Julian knew exactly where to cut. He played on my deepest fear, the stability of those innocent girls using their academic future as a bargaining chip, while I was still disoriented from sleep. "I won't let it happen, Mom. I can't let them be shamed," he choked out. My maternal instinct, that old stubborn reflex, began to override the analytical coldness I had tried to cultivate. I found myself walking toward my study in my robe, the floorboards cold under my bare feet. I sat at my laptop, the blue, blinding light of the screen in the pitch-black room, making me wince. I logged into my emergency reserve account, the money Richard intended for my medical care in old age, and watched the balance. My savings weren't a safety net anymore. They were a blood bag, and my son was the one holding the needle. I initiated the instant wire transfer for $18,000 to Julian's business account, JW Consulting, as he'd requested to bridge the gap. "I'm sending it, Julian," I said, my voice resigned. "But I need to see the notice from the school tomorrow." "You saved us, Mom," he replied. The panic in his voice miraculously smoothing out into relief. "I swear, you're the only one who cares about those girls' futures." As I hit confirm on the transfer, a notification popped up on the corner of my screen, a social media alert. Julian had just liked a post on a luxury real estate page for mountain cabins. He'd been awake and active online, curated and calm, at the very moment he was supposedly sobbing to me about a crisis. The transfer complete checkmark glowed on my screen, but as the silence returned to the house, a cold, clinical thought pierced through the exhaustion. Lakeside Prep never sends final notices at midnight on a Sunday. The bright fluorescent lights of the grocery store felt abrasive against my sleep-deprived eyes, a sharp contrast to the murky midnight fog I'd been living in since Julian's frantic call. 1 week had passed since I had authorized that $18,000 wire transfer, and the silence from my son's end was deafening. I had saved his world from collapse, yet the promised copy of the school's final notice had never arrived in my inbox. My clinical mind, trained to observe the subtle shift in a patient's pulse, was now obsessively charting the erratic heartbeat of my son's integrity. I attempted to reclaim some normalcy by navigating the aisles of the local Pike Place Market branch, but my movements were mechanical. I found myself staring at the waxy cold skin of the apples, my thoughts looping back to the sound of Julian's sobbing voice. "Just focus on the apples, Catherine," I whispered to myself. "One thing at a time." I realized with a hollow ache that Julian had effectively ghosted me the moment the funds cleared his account. I was a life support system he only acknowledged when the alarms were screaming. I was looking for crisp Honeycrisps, but I found a rotten core in my own family tree instead. The hum of the grocery store refrigeration unit seemed to grow louder, vibrating in my teeth as I turned into the organic produce aisle and nearly collided with a familiar figure. Helen, the sharp-eyed finance director of Lakeside Preparatory Academy, was wearing her usual tailored suit, even while browsing the organic kale. We had sat on 3 hospital fundraiser committees together over the last decade, and she offered a warm, professional smile that usually put me at ease. "Catherine, it is so good to see you," she said, her voice a pleasant melody over the smell of fresh rosemary and artisanal bread. I hesitated, my hand tightening on the handle of my cart. "Helen, it's good to see you too. I actually wanted to personally thank you for handling that tuition mess last Sunday. I know a midnight server error must be a nightmare for your department." Helen paused, her hand hovering over a bundle of greens. "Tuition mess, Catherine. I'm not sure what you mean. Our billing cycle was completed on the 15th. I felt a sudden sharp ringing in my ears that had nothing to do with the store's ambient noise. The panic I had felt on Sunday night began to morph into a cold, leaden dread. "Well, Julian called me quite late," I said, my voice wavering despite my best efforts to remain clinical. "He said there was an emergency notice, that the girls were at risk of expulsion if 18,000 wasn't wired immediately." Then Helen froze. It wasn't the cold of the refrigerator aisle. It was the look of genuine pity in her eyes. "Catherine, our finance office is closed on Sundays, and our system isn't even programmed to generate notices after business hours," she said softly. My stomach dropped as the facade Julian had built shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Helen leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper that felt like a death knell. "Catherine, we haven't sent a late notice to Julian in 3 years. In fact, he told us last month that the girls were receiving a full scholarship from a private donor." "Expulsion, Catherine. You've been our most consistent payer, but the school hasn't seen a dime from your son's accounts in months." The steering wheel felt slick under my palms as I sat in the supermarket parking lot, the rhythmic thumping of my heart drowning out the sound of the rain against the roof. Helen's words continued to toll in my head like a funeral bell, each strike a fresh trauma. Julian had stood in my garden eyes red with what I thought was grief and told me he needed a bridge. Now I knew the truth: the school hadn't seen a dime of my money in months. I had funded a private scholarship for my own granddaughters, only my son had neglected to tell me I was the donor. And then he had the audacity to bill me for a second. Phantom tuition to cover his own tracks. "Breathe, Catherine," I told myself, my vision blurring. "You have handled cardiac arrests in the dead of night. You have held literal hearts in your hands. You can handle a betrayal by your own flesh and blood." I reached for my phone, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly dropped it between the seats. I needed a mind as clinical as my own, but sharpened by the law. I dialed Leonie in Denver. My daughter, the corporate litigator who had always seen through Julian's charm, picked up on the third ring. "Mom, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice carrying a faint trace of static. I told her everything: the birthday ambush at Canlis, the digital erasure from the family photos, the midnight frantic call for $18,000, and Helen's revelation in the produce aisle. "I've been tracking Julian's business filings, Mom." Leonie interrupted, the sharp clicking of her keyboard, audible in the background. "I didn't want to worry you until I was sure, but JW Consulting LLC was on the brink of being dissolved last month for non-payment. Your tuition transfers weren't for the girls, they were his literal life support." Wire fraud. Lainey didn't say mistake. She said felony. I sank back against the headrest, the smell of damp car upholstery suddenly oppressive. I feel like such a fool, Lainey. I was so desperate to be the anchor for this family that I became the mark. Mom, stop. Lainey's voice was firm, cutting through the cold, biting wind, whistling through my cracked window. You are not a fool. You are a victim of a coordinated long con. If he told the school the girls had a private scholarship, he likely forged your signature on tax documents to claim your gifts as business income for the firm. When did my son stop being a Vance and start being a predator? I realize now that the $18,000 I'd wired on Sunday wasn't a bridge to the school. It was likely a bridge to his mortgage or a credit card debt he couldn't hide any longer. Lainey's silence on the other end was heavy, filled with the lethal intent I had seen her use in courtrooms. Lainey's voice went cold, the legal enforcer finally taking over. Mom, don't say a word to him. Not a single word. No texts, no calls, no payment requests. I'm booking a flight for tomorrow. I'm bringing every filing, every signature, and every forensic record I can find. We aren't just going to Christmas, we're going to war. I opened my laptop, the screen's artificial glow cutting through the heavy Seattle mist, like a scalpel ready to debride a festering wound. My study was silent except for the rhythmic, frantic clicking of my laptop trackpad and the low, steady breathing of Lainey on speakerphone. We weren't just checking emails anymore. We were conducting a digital autopsy on a betrayal that felt more like a premeditated crime than a family dispute. The bitter, burnt smell of over-extracted coffee hung in the air, a testament to the hours I had spent staring at the cold blue light of the monitor. Look at the syntax, Lainey, I said, my voice dropping into the clinical flatline I used when delivering a difficult diagnosis. Breyer isn't just excluding me. She's diagnosing me as an overstimulant to justify my exile. She's using clinical language to pathologize my presence so Julian doesn't have to feel like a bad son for throwing me away. Lainey's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and impatient. It's not an email, Mom. It's a restraining order wrapped in a thank you note. She thanks you for the tuition in the first paragraph and bars you from the house in the second. It's a tactical maneuver to keep the money flowing while removing the oversight. I felt a sharp, cold ache in my jaw from clenching my teeth. Have you ever seen a photo of your own blood being spilled and realized the person holding the cup was smiling? I found myself navigating away from the email, my fingers moving with a mind of their own toward the shared family photo galleries Leona Mercer maintained online. I discovered an album titled Family Paradise 2024. The vibrant, taunting blue of the Cabo Ocean exploded across my screen, mocking the gray drizzle outside my window. There was Julian, my son, laughing on the deck of a private yacht, clinking crystal glasses with Leona. I checked the date stamp on the images. The trip occurred exactly 3 days after I had wired the emergency $18,000 to save the girls from a phantom expulsion. They aren't just using my money for school, Lainey. I whispered the words, catching in my throat. They're clinking crystal on my retirement savings. Screenshot everything. Lainey commanded, her voice vibrating with a lawyer's predatory focus. Every sunset, every cocktail, every smug smile. I want a record of every cent they spent while you were worrying about tuition. $12,000. My granddaughter's college fund was currently being served as a round of poolside margaritas. As I zoomed in on a photo of Julian lounging by a zero-edge pool, my heart skipped a beat. In the background, resting on a teak table next to his arm, was a new limited edition watch. I recognized the distinct bezel immediately. It matched the exact price point of that $15,000 consulting fee I had discovered in the 2019 records. The theft hadn't started recently. It was a 5-year systemic harvest. My jaw tightened further when I found a photo caption from the resort's concierge thanking Mr. Julian Vance for his generous $5,000 cash tip. That money was never mentioned in the family budget. I zoomed in on the very last photo in the album, a celebratory toast between Julian and Leona. My eyes locked onto the unmistakable reflection in Leona's oversized sunglasses. Balanced on the glass table between them was a stack of legal folders. Even through the distorted reflection, I could read the bold print on the top tab, Vance Estate Liquidation. My blood turned to ice. They weren't just spending my current cash, they were already carving up the remains of my life. As a physician, I've spent my life respecting the weight of a professional diagnosis. But searching for the woman who reportedly diagnosed me as unfit felt like hunting for a ghost in my own medical history. I opened a new tab on my browser, the blue, sterile light of the medical board website reflecting in the dark wood of my desk. My clinical instinct had been screaming ever since I read Breyer's email, and now I intended to find the heartbeat of this phantom provider. I used my credentials to access the Washington State Department of Health Provider Credential Search, a portal I had used 1,000 times to verify referrals for my tiny cardiac patients. I meticulously typed in the name Miranda Kaplan. I tried every possible spelling alternating between psychologist, psychiatrist, and licensed social worker. I even checked neighboring Oregon and Idaho just to be thorough. The screen repeatedly flashed, "No results found." It was a digital confirmation of a betrayal so deep it made my hands steady with a cold, focused fury. Nothing. No Miranda Kaplan in the entire Pacific Northwest, I muttered to the empty room. You didn't just lie, Breyer. You committed medical identity theft. I realized then that the name Kaplan was likely a lazy pull from that medical drama Breyer watched every Tuesday night, a fictional authority used to banish a real grandmother. Zero. Not a single trace, not even a heartbeat of a record. Determined to leave no stone unturned, I picked up the landline and dialed the Lakeside Preparatory Academy counseling office. I adopted my most professional tone, the one I used during hospital board meetings. "This is Dr. Catherine Vance," I said when a woman answered. "I'm verifying outside provider coordination for my granddaughters Pearl and Faye. I'm looking for the contact notes regarding a Dr. Miranda Kaplan." The high-pitched hold music of the school office grated on my nerves, a tinny, cheerful sound that felt like mockery. Finally, the head counselor came on the line, her voice filled with a confusion that was all too telling. "Mrs. Vance. Or Dr. Vance, I should say. I've been here 12 years, and we have no record of a Dr. Kaplan. No one by that name has contacted the school regarding the twins or any overstimulation issues. If there was no doctor and no therapy, then what exactly was Breyer protecting those girls from, or was she just protecting her mother's exclusive access? While I was still on hold waiting for a supervisor, I pulled up my granddaughter's insurance portal, a policy I still paid for as part of my legacy fund. I scrolled through the claims history for the last 3 years. My eyes narrowed as I saw a sea of dental checkups and sports physicals, but not a single claim for mental health or therapy. They weren't even in treatment. The school counselor's final words chilled me more than the empty registry ever could. Doctor. Vance, I should also mention that Pearl and Faye haven't missed a day of school for appointments. But their father did come in last week to withdraw their emergency contact info, your name specifically. I hung up the phone, a cold, hollow feeling expanding in the pit of my stomach. Julian hadn't just stolen my money. He was actively erasing my existence from the girls' lives one document at a time. As a doctor, I knew that a steady heart rate could mask internal bleeding. As a mother, I was beginning to realize that Julian's successful marketing consultancy was a tourniquet applied to my own bank account. The counselor's revelation about my removal as an emergency contact had left me with a surgical precision of purpose. My voice didn't tremble as I dialed the number for a man I hadn't spoken to since Richard's estate was settled. Elias Thorne, a forensic accountant with a face like a sharpened flint and eyes that saw only deficits and credits, sat behind a desk cluttered with digital autopsies when I arrived at his office. The downtown Seattle skyline was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the interior was dominated by the sharp, stinging cold of the office's air conditioning and the smell of stale coffee and laser printer toner. "I don't need the family history, doctor." Vance Elias said, his voice as dry as the heavy bond paper I clutched in my hands. "I just need the money trail." I handed over the stack of bank statements and the power of attorney Julian had urged me to sign years ago. "The trail leads to my son Elias," I replied, sitting across from him. "I just need to know if it ends at the school or somewhere else." He scanned the power of attorney, first his brow furrowing slightly. This isn't a standard document, Catherine. This was an irrevocable authorization to move funds between any linked Vance family accounts. It gave Julian total legal cover to treat your savings as a liquidity pool for his own ventures. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. A funnel. A perfectly legal, perfectly heartless drain. Elias began a preliminary sweep of the digital records on his monitors, the low, persistent hum of high-end computer towers providing a white noise backdrop to my undoing. He moved with a clinical detachment that I found both terrifying and reassuring. Within minutes, he began to map the flow. Your direct deposits go into Julian's personal education trust account, he explained, pointing at a cascading series of figures. But they don't stay there. They are immediately swept into JW Consulting, LLC. From there, the money becomes a business expense. He's laundering your retirement through his firm's payroll, Catherine. My money. It's being used to pay his own salary, I asked the words, feeling like ash in my mouth. He nodded his pen, hovering over a fragmented line of smaller payments that disappeared into the corporate ledger. The spreadsheets weren't just math. They were an autopsy of my trust. Every dollar I thought was securing Pearl and Faye's future was instead being fragmented into business deductions and marketing overhead. Elias pulled up a secondary screen, a public record database that flickered with a new set of names. He paused, tapping his pen against the screen as a specific business partner for JW Consulting appeared. "Look at this," he said. The private donor Julian mentioned to the school, the one providing the scholarship. That donor is actually a shell company owned by Leona Mercer. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, a calculated conspiracy between my son and his mother-in-law to strip mine my life. Elias' face hardened as he looked at me, his eyes reflecting the cold light of the monitor. "We found where the money is bleeding, Catherine. It's not just going to school fees. He's been paying off a mortgage on a property you don't even know exists." I stared at the blinking cursor in my inbox, the notification light pulsing like a warning light on a heart monitor, just before the flatline. The email from Elias Thorne sat there heavy with the digital weight of 1,000 betrayals. When I finally clicked the secure link, the screen bloomed with a clinical line-item autopsy of my life's work. My breath hitched as I realized that Julian hadn't just made a mistake. He had choreographed a systematic harvest. The report showed that my son began siphoning funds as early as 6 months after Richard's death. It was a staggering revelation. While I had been holding Julian's hand through his supposed mourning, he had been using that grief as a tactical blind, reaching into the accounts Richard left behind before the grass had even taken root on his grave. $148,000. I whispered to the empty study, the sound of my own voice alien in the oppressive silence. $148,000 stolen by my own flesh and blood. Every tuition check I thought I was writing for Pearl and Faye had been diverted, replaced by a phantom scholarship that was nothing more than a paper shield to keep the school from calling me. I watched the scroll bar move as I descended into the inventory of his greed. It was a meticulously categorized descent into moral bankruptcy. $50,000 had been funneled into a volatile cryptocurrency wallet, a digital gamble played with my security. $48,000 went toward a down payment on a lakefront cabin registered in Breyer's name, the secret property Elias had teased. Another $30,000 paid for a luxury SUV, while $20,000 was laundered through invoices for home office renovations that, upon closer inspection of the line items, were actually high-end kitchen upgrades. Crypto, a cabin, a new life built on the bones of my old one. The Cabo vacation hadn't been an isolated lapse in judgment. It was merely the visible tip of a massive frozen iceberg of deceit. I stood up and walked to the printer, needing to feel the physical weight of this evidence. The mechanical hum and warm ozone smell of the printer filled the room as the pages began to slide out the black ink, appearing in sharp, unforgiving blurs on the stark white paper. As I reached for the first sheet, a sharp, stinging sensation flared across my index finger. I pulled back, watching a thin line of red bloom against the white margin. A paper cut. It was a tiny, insignificant wound compared to the hemorrhaging of my trust, but it was the catalyst that finally broke my clinical detachment. The paper felt hot in my hands, as if the ink itself were still burning through the remnants of my maternal love. They didn't just want a future for the girls. They wanted a lifestyle they hadn't earned, and they were happy to let me subsidize their luxury at the cost of my own survival. I reached the final page and saw a recurring monthly transfer to an offshore account labeled Retirement Supplement. The audacity of it was the final blow. Julian was planning for his own golden years by cannibalizing mine. My legs finally gave out the hallway floor cold against my knees as I clutched the evidence of my son's theft to my chest, letting out a sound that wasn't a sob, but a scream that had nowhere to go. The granite of Richard's headstone was biting cold against my fingertips, a stark, honest chill that felt more like family than my own son's touch ever had in years. I knelt in the thin Seattle frost, the smell of pine needles and damp earth clinging to the air around me. For 40 years, Richard and I had been the gatekeepers of our legacy. Yet in the 4 years since he had passed, I had allowed our son to dismantle everything we built. I let him turn my love into a line of credit, Richard, I confessed in a low whisper, my voice catching in the biting wind that rattled the remaining autumn leaves. The shame of being robbed was a heavy weight, but the shame of being fooled by the boy we raised was heavier. I reached out to adjust the small memorial vase, and my fingers brushed against a small, weathered envelope tucked into the back of the stone. I pulled it out, recognizing Richard's steady hand. It was a secret letter he must have hidden there during his final weeks. My eyes blurred as I read his warning, a father's intuition that Julian's ambition lacked a moral compass, a plea for me to be the steel if he could not. I'm going to stop it, Richard. I'm going to find my steel again. I stood up, the grief that had collapsed me onto my hallway floor now hardening into something surgical and cold. Steel. That was what Richard was made of. It was time to find mine. The walk back to the car was steady, my boots crunching purposefully over the gravel. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the maternal pity that had clouded my judgment was gone. I found Leonie waiting for me, leaning against her rental car with a grim look of readiness that mirrored my own. She had flown in from Denver the moment I told her about the forensic report, and she wasn't here as a grieving daughter. Leonie Vance, the corporate litigator who had spent a decade dismantling frauds, was now my strategic ally. She was carrying 3 professionally bound black folders, the legal ammunition for the meeting I knew was coming. The plane ride was long enough for me to draft the demand letters. Mom, she said, her voice sharp and clinical. We aren't asking for respect anymore, we're mandating it. Leonie didn't look like my little girl anymore. She looked like a storm front moving in from the Rockies. We walked into the kitchen, the house feeling larger and quieter than before. She laid the folders out on the counter, the sharp clinical sound of the heavy covers hitting the marble echoing through the room. Julian has no idea what's coming, does he? I asked. Leonie shook her head. No. And I've already contacted a colleague at the DA's office to hypothetically discuss the wire fraud evidence. If he doesn't comply, we ensure our leverage is absolute. I watched her flip through the pages, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the betrayal. Leonie clicked the first bound folder shut and looked me dead in the eye. Mom, Julian just tried to call my office to ask for a loan. He's underwater and he's getting desperate enough to sink us all. The realization that he was still hunting for new victims while the old ones were still bleeding out confirmed everything Elias Thorne had found. The time for quiet mourning was over. The time for the audit had begun. The sudden frantic vibration of my phone against the marble countertop sounded like a rattlesnake, warning snapping me out of the legal haze Leonie and I had built around ourselves. I reached for the device, my hand hovering over the cold, unyielding surface of the kitchen island, before I finally snatched it up. A text notification from Hattie blinked on the screen, and my heart performed a sickening, heavy roll in my chest. I tapped the message, my vision blurring with hot, angry tears as I read the words that no grandmother should ever have to see. Grandma, why don't you love us anymore? Mommy says you're too busy to come for Christmas because you're mad at us. Please don't be mad. I want to see you. The cruelty of it was a physical blow to my solar plexus, leaving me breathless and reeling. They're using her, Leonie. I whispered, my voice trembling as I showed the screen to my daughter. They're poisoning a 9-year-old to protect their cabin. But as I stared at the timestamp and the specific clinical phrasing, a cold clarity began to override the initial heartbreak. Hattie doesn't have a personal phone. She uses the family iPad. This message had been sent directly from Breyer's phone through the child's emergency contact app. It was a fabricated plea, a ventriloquist act using my granddaughter's innocence to guilt me into absolute silence. Breyer hadn't just stolen my retirement. She was now harvesting my soul. Poison. That's what Breyer was dripping into those girls' ears. Pure distilled poison. I felt the maternal fury rising within me, a heat that burned away the last remnants of my hesitation or pity. Before I reveal the truth behind this voicemail from Julian, if you are still with me, comment A if you think he's truly desperate, or B if it's another act. Please note the next part includes fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. If you're not comfortable with dramatized details, you're free to stop here. I realized then that the weaponization of my granddaughters was the final undeniable proof of Julian's total instability. I ignored a frantic, stuttering voicemail that arrived moments later, Julian's voice sounding ragged and desperate, a performance I no longer believed in. I wasn't going to cry for them anymore, Leonie. I was going to make them answer for every cent and every single lie they told in my name. Did they really think I would prioritize a dollar amount over the souls of my granddaughters? I opened a fresh message thread on my screen, my fingers moving with lethal surgical intent. I addressed it to Julian and Breyer CCing Leonie's professional legal email to ensure they understood the shift in gravity. The blue aggressive glow of the send button felt like a trigger under my thumb, ready to be pulled. I drafted the ultimatum with the same precision I once used to map a bypass family meeting. December 5th, 2 p.m. Be there or I decide about the tuition payment alone. No excuses. I hit send on the ultimatum, the blue bubble of the message feeling like a depth charge launched into the center of their carefully constructed lies. Julian replied within seconds his text, a frantic defensive scramble that lacked any remorse. He threatened to move the girls to a different state if I continued this harassment, a desperate move that only solidified my resolve. I didn't wait for the reply. I just turned to Leonie and said, "Pack the projector. It's time for show and tell." The front door to Julian's house didn't just open. It yielded the heavy oak swinging back as if even the architecture knew the piece was over. The sound of my heels and Leonie's clicking against the polished hardwood floor felt like a steady rhythmic march toward a long overdue reckoning. We entered the living room to find the air thick with the smell of expensive candle wax and the acrid tang of cold sweat. Julian stood by the fireplace, his posture a brittle mix of defiance and panic, while Breyer sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her knuckles white. Leona Mercer sat nearby, her arms crossed tightly, her socialite mask fixed with a layer of foundation that couldn't quite hide the tension in her jaw. I didn't offer a greeting. Instead, I walked directly to the mahogany dining table and set down the portable projector Leonie had helped me pack. The whirring sound of the projector fan filled the sudden silence, a low mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. Julian stepped forward, his face flushed. "Mom, what is this? We can talk like adults without the gadgets." I ignored him, the sharp rhythmic clicking of the projector remote in my hand being the only response. A blinding white light hit the pristine wall, and then the first slide appeared in bold black font, $430,000, the cost of disrespect. "Sit down, Julian," I said, my voice dropping into the clinical flatline I once used for terminal consultations. "This isn't a social visit, it's an audit." Julian lunged toward the table, his hand reaching out to physically block the lens, but Leonie was faster. She stepped into his path, her face a storm front of legal iron, and served him with a folded document on the spot. "It's a cease and desist, Julian," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "If you touch that projector or try to leave this room, the next person you talk to will be a process server. Audit." The word hit the room like a gunshot. "Catherine, really this theatrics is so middle class." Leona sneered, though I noticed her fingers trembling against her forearm. I clicked the remote again. The screen transitioned to a side-by-side comparison that made Breyer let out a sharp, audible gasp. On the left was the email she had sent me, the one weaponizing the name of Dr. Miranda Kaplan to justify my exile from the girls' lives. On the right was the certified letter from the Washington State Medical Board confirming that no such doctor existed, paired with a transcript from the school registrar. "You used my profession as a weapon to keep me from my granddaughter's Breyer," I said, looking her directly in the eye with the icy precision of a surgeon identifying a tumor. "But you forgot one thing I know how to check a pulse." Did they really think a ghost doctor could stop a living woman with a paper trail? I watched the color drain from Breyer's face until she was as white as the wall behind her. She stammered, her eyes darting toward Leona for a lifeline. I can explain. Julian told me to... She trailed off. In her panic, her gaze lingered on her mother, and I realized then that the name Kaplan hadn't been an accident. It was a character from an old soap opera Leona used to watch religiously. I clicked the remote one last time, and the screen transitioned from the fake doctor to the bank records of JW Consulting. "The doctor was a ghost, Breyer," I said softly. "But this theft is very, very real." The flickering transition of the projector felt like a guillotine blade, falling on the remaining shreds of Julian's dignity. I watched Julian's eyes dart toward the corner of the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist, as I brought up the map of his digital offshore accounts. "By the way," I said, my voice steady enough to chill the air, "I have been recording this entire conversation since the moment Leonie and I walked through that door. If you even think about threatening to move the girls or hiding them, this recording becomes Exhibit A in both a custody battle and a federal fraud case." Julian collapsed into his chair, the weight of the evidence finally pinning him down. I clicked to the next slide, a spreadsheet detailing the systematic siphoning of $148,000. I read the entries with clinical detachment. $50,000 in crypto, $48,000 for a down payment on a lakefront cabin you kept hidden in Breyer's name and luxury SUV payments. I paused, leaning into the silence. "Tell me, Julian, which twins' education was that meant for? Was Faye supposed to live in the cabin while Pearl went to school?" "Mom, please." Julian sobbed the sharp, stinging salt of his tears visible as they hit the mahogany table. The market was down. I was just trying to grow the fund. It wasn't stealing, it was an investment. Parasite. It's a harsh word for a co-grandmother, but it was the only one that fit as I turned my focus toward Leona. She had already begun to reach for her designer bag, her chair making a screeching sound against the hardwood as she prepared to flee. I stepped into her path, the smell of expensive burnout candles lingering between us. "You aren't leaving yet, Leona. We need to talk about your investment in the scholarship." I clicked the remote to reveal that the private donor money Julian had bragged about was actually just a recycling loop of my own stolen retirement funds, funneled through Julian's firm to pay for Leona's gated community lifestyle. "You aren't a grandmother, Leona. You're a business partner in a family fraud." Leona's sophisticated mask didn't just crack, it shattered. "You're just bitter, because they love me more." She shrieked, her voice thin and desperate. "At least I'm fun to be around, not some cold statue counting pennies." Did Leona really believe a designer bag could hide the stench of a stolen retirement? I looked at her with pity, seeing a woman terrified of losing her social standing. The cold, clinical feel of the tax lien paperwork in my hand felt like the only real thing in the room. I reached into my folder and pulled out the evidence of her own crumbling house of cards. "I have the records for your second mortgage, Leona. I know you were waiting for Julian's next tuition check to pay your own overdue taxes." I leaned over the table inches from Leona's face and handed her the folder containing her own tax liens. The smell of her heavy perfume was suffocating, but I didn't blink. The private donor is broke Leona, and Julian isn't your savior anymore. He can't even save himself. The room fell into a deathly quiet, the only sound being the hum of the projector and the ragged, broken breathing of the man who used to be my son. I looked at Leonie, who stood by the door like a silent sentry. The autopsy was nearly complete, and it was time to see if anything was left to save. Julian didn't just stand up. He lurched forward, his shadow lengthening across the projected bank statements like a man finally stepping out of a long, dark eclipse. He looked at Leona not with the practiced deference he had shown for years, but with the raw, jagged edges of a man who had finally hit the bottom. The silence in the room was absolute save for the hum of the projector and the smell of ozone as the electronics cooled. Julian turned his gaze toward Leona, his voice trembling, but clear. "Get out, Leona," he said, his words landing like heavy stones in the quiet room. "You didn't want a family, you wanted a benefactor. We're done." Leona's eyes widened, her socialite mask finally disintegrating into a mess of smeared foundation and panic. "Julian, after everything I've done for your reputation," she shrieked, clutching her designer bag as if it were a life raft. "You were the one who told me Mom was a cold statue," Julian barked back. "You whispered that we needed to manage her, that we deserved the status. I was a fool to listen, but I'm done being your ATM." He pointed toward the door, his hand steady for the first time all afternoon. "Get out." 2 words that cost Leona her luxury and Julian his pride. We watched in silence as Leona scrambled to gather her things, the clicking of her heels fading down the driveway in a frantic, uneven rhythm. I turned off the projector, the room plunging into a soft, natural twilight that felt far more honest than the digital glare. Julian admitted then that he had already prepared a resignation from JW Consulting weeks ago. The guilt of the theft had paralyzed him, making him unable to work while he watched my savings drain. The room fell into a heavy, mournful quiet as I presented the final bound folder Leonie had prepared. I laid it on the table, the sharp scratching sound of a ballpoint pen on heavy vellum echoing through the room as I opened it to the signature page. "I am not bailing you out anymore, Julian," I said, my voice maintaining its surgical finality. "I am holding you accountable. That is what a mother does." The terms were non-negotiable. He would repay the stolen $148,000 at $2,000 a month. His tuition support would end after the next school year, and I would have unconditional, unmediated access to my granddaughters. Briar sat in the corner, her head bowed in a state of broken submission, while Julian reached for the pen. The pen felt like a surgical needle stitching together a family that had been ripped open by greed. I watched him sign the dampness of the agreement paper where his tears fell, making the ink bleed slightly. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice a broken rasp. "I'm so sorry." I didn't tell him then that this entire session was being live-streamed to a private cloud server, shared with my attorney, ensuring this signed confession was ironclad. I just watched him blot the last signature dry. As the last signature was blotted dry, Julian looked up at me, his eyes hollow and red. "Will I ever see you again, Mom? Not for the money, but just because I looked at my son, seeing the boy he used to be buried under the wreckage of his choices, and felt the first flicker of a different kind of peace. The smell of pine needles and cinnamon normally felt like a warm embrace, but as I stood on Julian's doorstep that Christmas Eve, the air felt thin, as if the whole world were holding its breath with me. 3 weeks had passed since the audit, 3 weeks of silence, while the debris of our confrontation settled. I reached out and touched the festive wreath, the sharp scent of fresh evergreen clinging to my skin, before finally ringing the bell. Julian opened the door almost immediately. He looked different. The expensive, frantic sheen of the boutique consultant had been replaced by a quiet, humble fatigue. I noticed his wrists were bare. The luxury watch, that gleaming symbol of his deception, was gone. He had already sold it to make his first restitution payment early, a gesture of sincerity I hadn't expected. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Thank you for being here." I walked into a house that felt fundamentally changed. There was no Leona Mercer dominating the foyer, no performative luxury, and no underlying tension about who was footing the bill. The atmosphere was subdued, honest, and for the first time in years, authentic. Suddenly, I heard the thunder of small feet. Grandma. Pearl and Faye rushed toward me, their faces lit with a pure, unadulterated joy that Julian couldn't have stolen if he'd tried. Pearl Vance, my 9-year-old granddaughter who inherited her father's quick smile, but my own analytical eyes, threw her arms around my waist. Faye Vance, Pearl's twin, and the more sensitive soul, squeezed my hand as if she were afraid I might vanish again. "We missed you so much," they chimed together. Despite the financial carnage, I realized that this bond was the one thing my son hadn't managed to successfully liquidate. Silence. No Leona, no lies. Just the sound of family. Dinner was a quiet affair, the menu simple, and the conversation centered on the girls' school projects rather than social status. After the plates were cleared, Briar approached me. She handed me a small wrapped gift, her eyes meeting mine with a genuine contrition that lacked her usual sugary veneer. "I found this in an old folder," she said softly. "I want you to know your family, Catherine, always. I'm sorry for trying to rewrite that." I unwrapped the frame to find a candid photo I had never seen Richard in the hospital, holding the newborn twins, his face radiating a pride I thought had been lost with him. The cool, smooth glass of the picture frame felt like an anchor. "Thank you, Briar," I replied, my voice steady. "Respect is a better gift than any lobster dinner." I accepted the gesture not with total forgiveness, but with a clinical willingness to monitor the patient for recovery. Do you know what healing feels like? It feels like a bone being reset, painful, loud, but finally straight. The evening ended with a promise of transparency that felt ironclad. On January 2nd, as I sat in my quiet kitchen, a formal legal notice appeared in my inbox. Julian and Briar had officially listed the secret lakefront cabin for sale to accelerate the repayment of the stolen funds. Moments later, my phone chimed with the sterile, satisfying ding of my bank app. The first $2,000 wire transfer had cleared. For the first time in 5 years, the money was finally moving in the right direction, and my heart began to beat with a rhythm that was no longer dictated by fear. The house smelled of roasting turkey and sage, a scent that finally belonged to me again, untainted by the metallic tang of fear or the bitter aftertaste of a lie. The bright morning light of November 2025 poured through my kitchen windows as I prepared for the first Thanksgiving I had hosted in nearly 5 years. Outside, the Seattle sky was a crisp, clear blue reflecting the newfound order of my life. Julian, Briar, and the girls arrived precisely at noon, but there were no performative displays of wealth this time. Instead of extravagant gifts bought with my own diverted funds, Julian carried 2 homemade pumpkin pies, while Briar held a bouquet of late-season flowers. Julian took his place at the head of the table, not with the frantic arrogance of a consultant, but with the quiet diligence of a man carving out a new character. As he sliced the turkey, he paused and raised a glass toward me. "To Mom," he said, his voice steady and sincere, "for loving us enough to tell us the truth when we were too lost to see it." I looked at my son, seeing the man Richard had always hoped he would become. "I am just glad to have my son back, Julian." I replied, my own voice thick with a peaceful authority. Not the consultant, just my son. Briar set the table with a humble efficiency, her movements lacking the theatrical edge of her previous life. We talked about school projects and the upcoming winter break, the conversation flowing with a natural ease that required no mediation from a phantom doctor. Julian shared that Leona had finally moved into a modest apartment across town and had taken a part-time job at a local florist. My intervention had forced a reality check that had rippled through the entire extended family. Steel. That was the secret ingredient in our family recipe now. A few weeks later, as we were decorating the Christmas tree in my living room, the sparkle of the lights reflected in Faye's wide, curious eyes. "Grandma, were you scared when you were mad at Mommy and Daddy?" she asked, her voice a tiny whisper. I knelt to her level, taking her small hand in mine. "Sometimes love has to be steel, sweetheart," I explained softly. "It's the only way to make sure it doesn't break." I realized then that by reclaiming my dignity, I hadn't just saved my retirement. I had provided a blueprint for these girls to protect their own futures. My heart wasn't an ATM anymore. It was a vault, and I finally held the only key. On a quiet, snowy December day, I made my final pilgrimage to Lakeview Cemetery. I stood before Richard's headstone, the rough, cold granite of familiar comfort. "I did it, Richard," I whispered, as the soft, muffled silence of falling snow enveloped us. "The house is quiet, the girls are strong, and our legacy is safe." As I turned to leave, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a final notification from my bank. The last dollar of the stolen $148,000 had been repaid 3 months ahead of schedule. I looked back at the fresh snow covering Richard's grave and smiled, the cold air filling my lungs with a purity I hadn't felt in years. The story of how I reclaimed my dignity and my family is finally complete. Looking back now, I realize this chapter of my life became one of those painful family drama stories people rarely talk about until the damage is already done. For too long, I believed that love meant endless sacrifice. But the truth I learned from this grandma story's experience is that generosity without boundaries can invite the wrong kind of dependence. If there is one lesson I hope you take from my journey, it is this: never confuse silence with peace. Sometimes protecting your dignity is the only way to protect the family you love. Many family drama stories begin with small compromises that slowly grow into betrayal. Mine certainly did. Yet through this difficult Grandma Stories chapter, I also remembered something important: faith matters. In the darkest moment, I trusted that God would reveal the truth in His time, and He did. Today I share this not out of anger, but as a reminder. Stories like these family drama stories and difficult grandma stories, can teach us that love must be guided by wisdom, courage, and self-respect. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Catherine's position facing a betrayal like this? Feel free to share your perspective in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. A gentle note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-world themes about family conflict and financial trust, certain elements have been dramatized to enhance the storytelling experience. If this type of content isn't what you're looking for, you're welcome to explore other videos that may suit you better.